The idea is simply this, that God would never allow any evil, or he wouldn't purpose any evil to occur unless he had some greater good that he intended with that evil.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the KKT Show podcast. I'm your host, Kiran, and today I'm joined by Pastor Scott Christensen. Pastor Scott Christensen was the pastor at Summit Lake Community Church for 16 years, and now he's the associate pastor at Kerrville Bible Church, Kerrville, Texas. He wrote 2 books, one, What About Free Will? Reconciling Our Choices with God's Sovereignty, and the other one, What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. Both amazing books, and I encourage all of you to check those out. Today we'll be discussing his second book, What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. Pastor Scott Christensen, it's a huge honor for me to have you in my podcast.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you.
Right. So, Pastor Scott, maybe we'll start with what was your motivation to write this book in particular? What about evil and a defense of God's sovereign glory in that aspect? What was the motivation behind it?
Yeah, I when I wrote my first book called What About Free Will, I was really grappling with the fact that the Bible teaches that God is sovereign in all that he does, including the work of salvation, and that God has chosen us before the foundation of the world. That caused me to grapple with the question of, well, where does my own choices come into play with that, and trying to understand the viewpoint of what is known as Calvinism. With regard to the human will, how does my will interact with God's sovereign will? And so grappled with those questions for many years, and I did a series of messages to my church in the book of Ephesians. And in Ephesians 1, Paul talks very directly and extensively about God's work of sovereign election. And so during the course of preaching those sermons, questions came up from my congregation about free will. Well, what about my choices? What about my free will? And so I wrote that book a couple of years later based on some material that I had produced for those sermons, and then expanded it into the book. And then I realized that once you get into this topic of free will, you start to intersect questions regarding the problem of evil, what is classically known as the problem of evil. In other words, for your listeners, that the basic idea is that if God is all good and he is all powerful, then why does he allow evil in the world? And many people, many theologians and Bible students answer that question by posing free will as the answer. In other words, God takes a risk in allowing evil to take place by allowing human beings the choice to choose or not to choose any particular direction that they wish to make. And so God takes a risk in evil occurring as a result of people maybe making an evil choice instead of a good choice. Well, I reject that notion. I think there's many good reasons why that cannot be true, and God still be God. And so we have to have a different understanding of how the relationship between human actions and divine actions work. And so I laid out much of that in the What About Free Will book. But then my publishing editor, suggested to me that I needed to expand my thoughts on the problem of evil. I had a small section in the Free Will book on the problem of evil and how the whole question of free will intersects that question.
Yeah.
And so So he suggested I needed to write a whole book on the problem of evil. I really didn't want to.
It is a tome for those of
he
you.
was he was constraining my will, and so I was forced under great duress to write the book. No, I'm just kidding.
No, yeah.
But no, I spent about 5 years working on the book, and really trying to grapple with as many questions as the issue raises, which is quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's such a thick book. But I try to treat every issue as thoroughly as possible, while at the same time presenting some positive reasons as to why God has not only just simply allowed evil in the world, but what may be shocking to your listeners, that God actually purposed evil in the world.
Yeah. Right.
So that's a little bit of a backdrop.
Yeah. And let's go into it. But maybe before that, let's define our terms a bit. So how would you define evil? Because I guess a lot of apologists might start to define evil with moral evil, natural evil, gratuitous evil, and in those fashion. So how would we start to define evil, and then maybe we'll move on from there to God's character in the
Sure.
whole concept.
So there, in philosophy and theology, there are two basic categories for evil, as you already noted. One is moral evil, and that has to do with the actions of moral agents, which would include, of course, God himself.
Right.
It would include human beings, and could even include angels and demons. Satan could be in that category of a moral agent. Someone who has a capacity for making moral decisions, right. And therefore are morally responsible. So any moral agent who is capable of making moral decisions, such as God, angels, and human beings, have moral responsibility, and everyone agrees with that. So then you have to define moral evil, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the other category of evil would be natural evil. So these things would include things like tornadoes or disease and sickness, just pain and suffering that comes from living in what the Bible would call a fallen world. In other words, due to the sin of Adam and Eve, in the garden, they brought about a curse upon the creation itself, such that we experience things that bring pain and suffering into our lives, not as a result of moral choices that people make. We can experience pain and suffering from that. If somebody kills your mother, they didn't do something directly to you, but their moral choice, their moral evil caused pain and suffering for you in terms of the grief that it caused you over the death of your mother. So that would be moral evil. But you also might have come one day and discover a message, somebody coming to you and say, "Oh, sorry to tell you this, but your mother just died of cancer in the hospital." Well, that wouldn't be the result of moral evil. That would be the result of living in a fallen world that has lots of natural evil as well. Things that aren't the result of moral choices that people make, but the result of a corrupted world that resulted from the fall of Adam and Eve. So those are the two basic categories. And then just to zero in on your question a little more directly with moral evil, how do we define moral evil? Well, basically, we have to have a standard, and that standard must be God himself. And so all questions of moral good and moral evil have to be related to who God is, what he has commanded, and what he has commanded in terms of what is morally good reflects the morally good character of God himself. And so there really can be no other standard than God himself with regard to morality.
Right. His own nature would be the standard for morality as such.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
right.
God doesn't just arbitrarily command certain things and say, this is good. I've decided that this is good and this
Yeah,
is
yeah,
evil.
yeah.
No, what he has commanded is rooted in his own character. He is essentially good
Good. Right.
in his moral righteousness, and therefore he is the moral standard. He is the morally righteous standard for all that is good. And so anything that deviates from the perfect moral standard of God himself then must be evil.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And a theodicy would be a defense of uh, why evil exists in the world when we consider God, I guess. So a theodicy would be to explain God and evil in some sense.
Yeah, technically there's two types of terms that are used in theology and philosophy to describe God's relationship to the problem of evil. And one is the word theodicy, as you mentioned. That is a word that combines the Greek word for God, which is theos, and the word for justice, which is dike in the Greek. So you combine those words together, and it's God and justice. And so the idea is, how can you justify God's existence in the face of evil? That's what theodicy literally means. It means to justify God and his purposes, or even his existence, period.
Right.
Because some people think that evil presents a problem for defending God's existence, and so that's the basic problem. But even if we admit that God exists, and I don't think that we even need to engage much of an argument there. We still have the problem. Well, how can a good God, how can a powerful God still live, coexist with evil in the world that he created to be good? So this raises really thorny questions for the Christian,
Right. Right.
as much as it would for the atheist who claims that evil disproves the existence of God. So getting back to the question, technically a defense in the parlance of theology and philosophy is just simply defending God against the charge that he is culpable for evil. And so it has a lesser burden resting upon what is technically called a defense, whereas a theodicy, on the other hand, doesn't merely seek to defend God against the charge that he is morally culpable or morally responsible for evil, but rather it actually tries to present a positive case for why God has purposed evil in the world.
Right.
So it carries a much greater burden with it than a defense does. And most philosophers and theologians are content to just stick with a defense. They're like, I don't want to venture into the notion of getting an actual explanation of why God purposed evil in the world. I'd rather just stick with defending him against all the charges that he is responsible for evil in the world.
Right, and it seems to me that the Reformed perspective is the only one that can actually explain not just the presence of evil in the world as such, but even the end of evil, as to why it even exists and how it can exist to the glory of God. So we will get to that. I guess that's what the greater glory theodicy would be, and we will certainly get to that. So I guess for those of the listeners who aren't all that familiar with the argument, maybe I'll just detail it out and in a few words. So this is David Hume, and I guess this is what he says: Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent. If he is both able and willing, then where does evil come from? So I guess that's the crux of that's the question in a nutshell as to God and evil. And so like Pastor Scott mentioned, there are these theodicies that will try to explain why it is that evil exists in the world, and from a reform perspective, in fact, the ultimate goal of it. So, Pastor Scott lists out six theodicies in your book. the free will defense, the natural law defense, the greater good theodicy, the soul making theodicy, best of all possible world theodicy, and the divine judgment defense.
Yes, yes.
Right. So you list out six of those, and I guess we did mention the free will defense a bit, but what I'd like to ask you about is the soul making theodicy, because that's what's very popular here. It seems to me that that a lot of people would like to assume the soul making theodicy. Now, I don't know if we'd use the term, but it seems to me to be that that's kind of where a lot of people are when you ask them about evil and God. So the fact that there is suffering in the world, the fact that there is evil in the world, helps you in some way to well, I guess it makes you soul. It enriches you. It sort of refines you in a way, as in the refine as fire and all of and that idea. So I guess the soul making theodicy is what's most popular here. But you mentioned that that's not a comprehensive theodicy at all. So can you explain the soul making theodicy and why you think that that might not be as comprehensive a theodicy as the one that we're going to talk about?
Sure, sure. The soul making theodicy certainly has some value to it, because we see the Bible explains that suffering, pain and suffering in the life of the Christian produces great character. God brings suffering into our lives in order to test our faith and make us stronger in terms of increasing our faith. First Peter talks about how God has brought various trials into our lives that refine us like fire refines gold, and casts out all the impurities, so that after you've gone through this trial, this fiery trial in your life, you come out the backside of that trial a much stronger Christian, your faith much stronger. A good example would be how do we develop courage unless we find ourselves in a fearful situation that challenges us to act with courage? Well, that usually involves some kind of pain and suffering, some kind of tragedy, or some kind of adversity that is necessary in order to forge courage. And so we would see a lot of value in that. However, one of the reasons why I don't believe that the soul making theodicy can be a comprehensive explanation for evil is because suffering and trials don't always produce character. Oftentimes, suffering in a person's life drives them further away from God. It drives them further into misery, and many people die in a state in tragic states of becoming worse people as a result of pain and suffering in their life, rather than becoming better people. And so, in fact, some people might argue, and I think this is probably true, that more people become worse due to the suffering that they experience in their life rather than becoming better. And so that when you place the weight of the number of people that probably suffer poorly under duress, under adversity and trials and tribulations and fiery, tragic circumstances in their lives, rather than it forging greater character, that seems to suggest to us that that this can't be the full explanation for evil in the world. It can be a partial explanation, but it can't be a comprehensive one.
It almost comes naturally to a lot of us, I guess, to expect suffering to produce a certain quality in us that we didn't possess. So when you go through trials of various kinds, you are kind of refined. And like you said, there certainly is a point to it, but it cannot be used to explain the totality of evil, why it exists in the first place, and like you said, therefore cannot really be the foundation for a comprehensive theodicy. So we'll move on from the soul-making theodicy to the major argument in the book, the greater good theodicy. And
Yeah.
I guess you even call it the greater glory theodicy. But let's start with the greater good theodicy. Uh, who is it good for? I guess greater good theodicy. So who is the good for? I guess that would be the question that I ask.
Yeah. So the greater, just to lay out, evil has come into the world, then he must not either be all good or he must not be powerful enough to stop or prevent that evil from occurring. But that's not the only way to answer the question. It could be that God has a very good reason for allowing evil. And so, for example, the soul-making theodicy could be one reason. But I don't think it fully answers all the questions that would be raised, and therefore I don't think it can be a comprehensive theodicy. Nonetheless, we have to say that if God is truly good, then anything that happens in this world, and because he is also all powerful and therefore sovereign in everything that takes place, he is ultimately, in an ultimate sense, responsible for everything that takes place in this world. Not necessarily in a moral sense, but in the broader sense of everything that happens in the world as a result of his planning it to be that way, or what Reformed theology calls God's decree. God has decreed all things that take place. And so if we understand that the character of God is that he is indeed all sovereign, all powerful, and yet at the same time, he is all good, that means that God can never have an evil purpose for anything that occurs in this world, but that he must have some good reason for it. A good example of that in the Bible would be the case of Joseph and his brothers. So, for example, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers after they wanted to kill him. And of course, they didn't kill him, but they thought of some other evil deed to do. So they thought to sell him into slavery and they'd be rid of him because they hated him. And so later on in Joseph's life, we learned that he was indeed a slave for some years in Egypt. Then he was in prison for a number of years, being falsely accused of rape, and eventually he came out of prison and became the prime minister of Egypt by answering Pharaoh's dreams that were divinely placed in his mind. And as a result of that, he predicted this great famine, and God gave him the wisdom to provide a solution to that famine. And so Pharaoh made Joseph basically second in charge in all of Egypt. So later on in his life, the brothers come and they confront him, and they recognize that they are guilty now and that he has the authority to punish them. And Joseph says, I don't want you to worry. I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I don't want you to worry. Even though you sent me here, i.e., you sold me into slavery and did this evil deed, and he acknowledges that what they did was evil. They themselves acknowledge what they did was evil. He then turns around and says, it wasn't really you that sent me here. It was God who sent me here. And then he summarizes that whole incident by basically saying what you meant, this is Genesis 50:20, says what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that's a very fascinating insight into reality, because what he is saying is that here you have human beings who in their minds were doing something that was motivated by evil thoughts and intentions, and they did an evil deed. And yet God superintended those evil actions himself, because he had some overriding good, some greater good that would have not occurred without that evil having taken place. And so basically, that lays out for us a biblical kind of zeroing in on a biblical view of what we would call the greater good theodicy. So that the idea is simply this, that God would never allow any evil, or he wouldn't purpose any evil to occur unless he had some greater good that he intended with that evil. Now, part of the problem with that is that we don't always know what those greater goods are. And so, but that's not necessary for us to be able to explain every good reason God has, for evil, because we don't have the mind of God. And so God can have all sorts of good reasons for evil that we may never know. Job never knew of the conversation between God and Satan that ensued in heaven while he is experiencing all this tragedy with the death of his children and the loss of his livestock and his whole livelihood and the loss of his health and all of that. We're never told. The book of Job never tells us why God did these things. And yet in the end, Job is restored and all of that, and good did come out of it. But even at that rate, you might ask, well, what were all these ultimate greater goods? Maybe in Job's lifetime, he didn't experience all of them. But anyway, so that's the basic position of the greater good theodicy. And then my theodicy in the book, which I call the greater glory theodicy, is a specific kind of subspecies, if you will, of the greater good argument. Most of theologians who provide the greater good argument, they're just speaking very broadly, whereas I kind of zero in even more and say, is there something even more to this notion that God does things for greater goods than just simply general good that we may not always know of?
Right. Yeah. And the story of Joseph, because a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, God foreknew what would happen, and then made it so that it would end in a way that was good. That would be the idea that a lot of Arminians here would say, and a lot of Pentecostals would say that they wouldn't necessarily go the route you took, but they'll say, right, so Joseph had a lot of trouble, and God used the evil that they did to bring about a certain good. But they wouldn't go as far as to say that God had a specific plan and intention even in the evil that was done by the brothers in the first place.
Right. So the idea is that God is just kind of going along with the story, and then suddenly evil occurs, and he's like, "Oh no, I got to fix this."
In
so
I
better intervene. I better intervene at this point and direct things in such a way that a good outcome will take place.
Would eventuate.
That's one way of looking at it, and some people actually hold that kind of position. But the Calvinist view, the Reformed view, is no, God actually planned this from the very beginning, because he plans the beginning to the end, as Isaiah says.
Right.
And everything falls under God's plan for the creation. Not everything is as important as some things. Whether or not you get up and brush your teeth is not nearly as important as Christ dying on the cross and rising from the dead. Nonetheless, everything falls under God's broad plan for history, and that would be the Reformed position.
Right.
And I lay a lot of that out in earlier chapters in my book, especially examining passages in Isaiah, Daniel, and Ephesians and Romans and other passages like that really speak very directly to God's sovereign control over everything, not just good in the world, but evil as well. And I think it's the only the only position that makes sense, because if you start to say that evil exists outside of God's control and God's purposes, then you really have a problem, because now you've got things happening that God has no control over.
Yeah, yeah.
And so he has to be sitting up in heaven, scratching his head, going, "Oh no, these terrible things are happening on earth. There's nothing I can do about it."
Right. Yeah.
That would not be the God of the Bible that we hold to, that we believe in. So what it means is that God must have some good purpose for evil occurring in his plan for the history of the world. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. If there are particular evils that God deems do not serve some greater good, then he will not purpose those things to take place in the world. And so any evil that occurs in the world would only occur because God had some good reason for it to occur. Now, do we always know what those reasons are? No, we don't. But we do know the reason for the greatest evil that has ever occurred in the world. And that would be the death of the most innocent man in the history of the world, which is Jesus Christ himself. And God purposed all of that, ironically, to solve the whole problem of evil. And this gets more into the greater glory theodicy.
And I guess Isaiah 45:7 would help us. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. So there are these verses that clearly talk about what you were saying, and clearly describe that the Lord decrees all that comes to pass. So yeah, it certainly helps us, the greater good theodicy, the greater glory theodicy. But maybe let's stretch it even backwards. And there is the view, and in fact this is the most common view held here, that the fall was a pretty bad thing to happen, and God used the fall, and then subsequently Christ had to come. But the fall in and of itself was a pretty bad thing. That Adam and Eve had the ability to choose, and had they not eaten of the fruit, we'd all be enjoying a life of peace and well-being. That's the common perception, and I guess that's probably the Arminian perception as well. But that's certainly not the case in a Calvinistic tradition, and nor in the Greater Glory theodicy or
Yeah.
felix culpa. And I like the term you used there, because I remembered the old John Milton poem, and I went back to it, and yeah, fortunate fall. So it's not that the fall happened, and it is in fact that the fall is fortunate, and that's an amazing thought. That is not a very common thought here, but I'd like you to describe felix culpa, the fortunate fall, not the fall that happened, but the fact that it is in fact fortunate, and in fact predestined by God to occur for maximizing his glory, his extrinsic glory, I guess.
Yeah. So I think in order to answer that question, this would be a good point at which to basically introduce what I call the greater glory theodicy, or the felix culpa theodicy, which means fortunate fall, to translate the Latin there. Basically, I try to ask the question, the really broad questions. And the broadest question, of course, is, why did God create the world in the first place? Why did God create human beings? Why did he create Adam and Eve? He didn't have any need to do that. God was fully self-satisfied in his own Trinitarian being for all eternity. So it wasn't like he was lonely or needed companionship or needed someone to love. He had perfect love between the members of the Trinity from all eternity, perfect fellowship and all of that. And so God had no need to create the world at all. So we have to at least admit that God's creation of the world was a free action on his part. He had no need to do it. And yet, what would be God's purpose in creating the world? Well, I suggest in my book that God wanted to display his glory to his creatures that he created. And I suggest that he didn't just want to display his glory, he wanted to display it supremely. In other words, he wanted to give the most supreme display of his glory that he possibly could. And Now, God is all glorious in and of himself. He doesn't need to display his intrinsic glory that is intrinsic to his own being as a Trinitarian God of the universe. But he does give outward displays of his glory to his creatures, what we call his extrinsic glory, in such a way that we can perceive, who God is. And so the question is, well, how has God most glorified himself? Well, if we look in the history of the world, there can be no greater place that we can see the glory of God than in the incarnation, the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so, but why was Jesus incarnated? Why did he die? And why did he rise again from the dead? Well, he did all of that to conquer sin and death, and to conquer evil itself. And so Christ came into the world as a redeemer, as the great hero of the broad story of history. But what did he do? He came to resolve a massive crisis in the world. And by coming in and becoming the hero, the redeemer who defeats evil through his death and resurrection, and thereby becomes the great hero of the story of history, God's glory is then supremely magnified in that event, in that action of the God of the universe taking on human flesh and dying the brutal death of the cross, whereby the full wrath of God is poured out upon him for sin and evil. He bears that wrath and then defeats it through his death and shows his victory by his resurrection. From a Christian perspective and from a broad perspective, period, there can be no greater glory that God could receive than through the person and work of Jesus Christ. However, so then we back up and we say that none of that would exist without evil. So without the fall, without Adam and Eve rebelling against God and creating this curse for the world, creating this crisis for all of history, there would be no need for Christ to come and redeem all of that. There'd be no reason for him to come and die on the cross and rise again from the dead, unless that had been part of a broad plan that God had to introduce evil into the world and then destroy evil in this great storyline with this incredible hero, this redeemer, Jesus Christ, who comes and saves the day, as it were. And by doing so, he magnifies God's glory beyond any way that God could magnify his glory in any other way. So the idea would be that, let's suppose God did create a situation in which Adam and Eve could have never sinned. He could have done that, right? He could have created Adam and Eve with the ability to never sin. Just like he will secure every believer in heaven with that same ability. We'll never be able to sin in heaven. So why didn't he just give Adam and Eve that ability in the first place? He didn't have to place a forbidden tree in the garden and say, don't eat of this tree.
Yeah.
Right? He could have prevented the serpent from slithering into the garden and tempting Eve by placing some flaming angels like he did later on to prevent Adam and Eve from going back into the garden. Yeah. Why didn't he just put those flaming angels there at the beginning so the serpent would never enter the garden and tempt Eve?
Yeah.
Well, he didn't do any of those things. And so it tells us that God purposed all of that to take place so that he could achieve this plan of redemption that he had planned out even before the foundation of the world, right? Just as Ephesians tells us that he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, in Christ. That means that he already had a plan for Christ to come into the world before he created the world in order to redeem the world. But in order to redeem the world, to redeem the world from what? To redeem a world that had fallen into sin. And so it fits the whole pattern of Scripture itself, which we often frame as creation, fall, redemption. I call it this kind of U-shaped story that every good story has. You start out with something good, something ideal, something happy, and then you have this crisis, some kind of fall, some kind of terrible thing that happens, and then you usually have a hero who comes and solves that crisis and restores the story back to the good that it's supposed to be. Right? It's not supposed to be down here, in the depths of despair. It's supposed to, we all long for happiness. We all long for there not to be evil in the world. And part of that longing is what makes stories of redemption so powerful to even the unbeliever. But what I suggest is that there's something even more powerful about the story of redemption, because I call it a J-shaped story. Because I say that the end result is better than the initial condition because of the fact that you went through this massive crisis. It makes the victory all the much sweeter than if there had never been a crisis in the first place. And so if the storyline is completely flat, you place Adam and Eve in the garden, they never sin, they're just perfectly good. There's no contrast. There's no sense of, wow, God's grace and God's glory and God's justice is amazing, because look at what happened and look at how he intervened and did all this, either to bring justice to evil in the world or to bring redemption. And so without the fall, there would be no opportunity for God to display his characteristics such as his mercy or his justice, because there'd be no need for mercy or justice in a world that didn't have a fall, that didn't have evil, that didn't have sin. And so I suggest that God planned the whole creation and the whole history of the world such that this fall would occur in order that he could magnify his glory, both in his justice, in his judgment, because he is indeed glorified in his judgment, but he's even more greatly glorified in his mercy and in his plan of redemption. And so even though the Bible, you can't find a verse that says, well, God purposed that Adam and Eve would fall such that blah, 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 blah would happen. But it's the whole storyline of Scripture that we see. God, there's no accidents, right? You read the story of the Bible and you begin to see, wait a minute, there is something happening here, and God is at work. And even in the evil that we see in the Bible and all the failures of human beings to do anything about this evil, we see that God is setting things up for this great Messiah that is going to come and be the true hero of the story. And throughout the rest of history, we see how his redemptive work is now unfolding. And God has a whole plan from beginning to end to magnify his own glory. And that's basically what I believe the Theodicy of the Bible is.
This is such a good way to explain it, and I thank you, and I'm really thankful to the way you explained it, because this is a really fabulous way to explain the whole narrative of Scripture. And you mentioned the monomyth as well, and myths and stories are fascinating here in our culture as well, and all of these portray some truths. Like C.S. Lewis talked about myths being lies, even though breathed through silver. And
Yes.
And the monomyth being this huge narrative structure that almost a lot of the world's myths conform to this pattern of you start in a pretty good place, and then you go down, and then there is conflict, and there's conflict resolution, and then you are redeemed, and you finally arrive at a place. And I guess that would be the U-shaped monomythic
Yes.
storyline. And then you use
Yeah.
it, and then you make the J-shaped storyline, and then you talk about the J-shaped storyline of the redemptive process in the Word of God through the greater glory theodicy, and it's wonderful. And I guess I'd like to ask you about the idea of true myth, because you mentioned that the heart of the book is in chapters 10 to 13, wherein you connect, when you talk about the monomyth and the idea of the true myth, or rather the one true story, I guess. And C.S. Lewis
Yeah.
and J.R.R. Tolkien talked about this, and I remember reading in Tolkien's essay on fairy stories about the eucatastrophe,
Yes.
and how you connect their ideas of there being this secondary belief of when you see something so wonderful, like when you see the Lord of the Rings, you have this secondary belief evoking inside of you that, oh, I wish this were true, but it isn't. And
Yeah.
then the true myth, the one true story, which is the reality to which all of these myths point. And you can find myths that point to this even in Indian classical myths as much as you can find in the Virgil or the Aeneid, or the great classical myths, and all of those things.
Sure.
And it's fascinating. And your connection between the monomyth and the redemptive narrative, the narrative structure in the Bible is also extremely fascinating. And I wanted to ask you about that, if you can maybe expound on that a
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. Basically, and I'm not a literary expert by any means, but literary critics who study world literature, all across the world, notice this pattern, this U-shaped pattern that is called the monomyth, the one myth or the one story, if you will. And myth is, you have to understand that the way I use myth in my book and the way that it's used in talking about storytelling, it's not myth in the sense of just falsehoods and things that are not true, but rather myths in the way that I use the term speak of stories that have particular meaning to a culture, that help shape the way that culture views itself. It's its stories. In America, we have our own myths about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and all these great leaders and whatnot.
Paul Revere
Um,
and his ride, as I remember that as well.
yeah, and so we shape those stories in such a way that they help us understand our place within the culture, as Americans, or in your case, as people from India or whatever. You have these, everyone has these stories that they tell, that they teach their children. But they all seem to have a similar set of elements where you have some crisis, some terrible event, or some evil, and then you usually have some hero who comes and saves the day, who comes and saves the people, or reverses the crisis and makes things better, after they got worse. And so you see this sort of storyline, and you see it in movies, you see it in novels, you see it in television, even sitcoms, that are comedies. There's usually some kind of, it's usually funny and whatever, we all laugh, but there's some kind of crazy thing that happens that shouldn't have happened. And by the end of the 30-minute comedy show, they've resolved it, and everybody's happy again at the end of the show. And
There's a conflict
but it shows,
resolution.
yeah, it shows that we are deeply affected by things that should not be the way they should be, that they are. Right? We live in a fallen world. We live in a world that's not the way it's supposed to be, and we instinctively, we intuitively know that. And so it creates within us this longing for the world to be right. Now the problem is we don't know how it's supposed to be right, so we make up these stories. We make up solutions that aren't based in the true reality that God has designed it. Nonetheless, they palely reflect this urge to know redemption. We seek redemption. We seek for the world to be made right because we know it's wrong. We know there's evil. We experience it every day. We experience it in our pain and suffering. And so we long for stories that help us grapple and cope with evil in the world. And so they become kind of an escape. A good movie, if you've seen the Marvel movies, right? We love the Marvel movies. Why? Because they're perfect examples of the monomyth, where you're dealing with these aliens or this great villain that comes and tries to, you know, you know, destroy half the world, and you've got the Avengers and they come and they save the day and they
Yeah.
become the great heroes. And we love those kinds of movies because we are all deeply impacted by an evil world and we long for it to be made right. We long for heroes to come and save the day. And so I just simply said what all Tolkien and Lewis were doing was recognizing that this is true in all the myths that you read in all the cultures across history, all around the world. So what does that tell you? It tells you that it's universal. It tells you that there's a universal experience of evil. There's a universal longing for redemption. And the Bible gives us the one true story that solves that in a way that is more magnificent than any story you've ever read. And I think it's so important for Christians to view the Bible within that lens of the whole narrative, because we have to see the whole picture. And then once we see the whole picture of the narrative of Scripture, then we can superimpose that in terms of our making sense of the world that we live in, and we can say, here it is. Here's the solution. And God, the whole history of the world is like a big storyline.
Yeah.
And hero is Jesus Christ himself. And he's already come and he's already died and he's already risen from the dead. And now he is ascended to the right hand of the Father, and he is reigning from on high, and he is going to come and consummate his kingdom. He's going to right every wrong. He's going to make sure that all injustices are made just. He's going to redeem people from their sin. He's going to create a kingdom that will be greater than Eden. And in the new heavens and the new earth, it will be a magnificent, far more glorious place than the unfallen world of Eden before Adam and Eve sinned. And all of it will bring magnificent glory to God and will bring deep and abiding satisfaction to those whom he has redeemed. Right. And so I just simply tried to draw parallels between what we see in literature and what we see in the broad arena of storytelling, and why storytelling is so powerful of a medium, for all human beings, and to show that it is a pale reflection of the one true story, which is what we see in Scripture.
That was an amazing part of the book. I enjoyed that. And to come to the end, the grace and glory effect. And you mentioned this grace as a result of the Bible's subversive model of redemption. And that's something that made me think about the effect that this has on the elect, the effect that this redemptive work has on the elect, which is that God has grace in the elect, and they are then to outwardly show mercy to one another. And you mentioned examples in the Holocaust that were extremely important, and I'd love if you could explain the grace and glory effect, the culmination of all of this in some sense.
Well, I use the life of Corrie Ten Boom, who's well
Yeah,
known uh, lady whose family hid Jews during the not in Nazi Germany during Hitler's reign of terror against the Jews,
yeah,
and
yeah,
her family were all captured and discovered they were hiding Jews in their house. And her father and mother were sent to concentration camps and died. Corey and her sister Betsy went to a concentration camp called Ravensbrück. It was a particular type of concentration camp for women, and they suffered there for a number of years. Her sister died in this camp, but Corey survived through really a miraculous kind of set of circumstances. Uh, but but the reason why I used her story, why I used the Holocaust, because the Holocaust has been such a singular example of horrific evil, of horrendous evil in the world. And there are different ways that we can respond to things like that. We can respond with the notion of just pure justice. Okay, we need to come and bring justice to bear upon Nazi atrocities, and we had to get in and get Hitler, and of course he committed suicide or whatever, but we had to then, if you look at the aftermath of the Holocaust, and we captured all of these Nazi war criminals and had the Nazi war trial in Nuremberg, right after the war and all that, so that we could exact justice against these people. Though that's one way that you can respond to evil in the world, and it's a way that God responds. God will be just, and ultimately He will pour out His wrath on injustice, both in the temporal realm and eternally in the great judgment to come at the end of the world. And so that's certainly one way that we can respond, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, there is something far more powerful in terms of a response to evil than just simply to seek justice. And that is, how can you extend mercy? And mercy is so unexpected, because when you're faced with someone who has done horrific crimes, you want justice. You don't want to extend mercy to that person. But the gospel is so powerful in terms of the grace that is poured out upon believers for crimes that we have done, that it produces within the believer um, a foundation, an impetus to extend that kind of mercy toward other people.
right,
So in the
yeah,
case of Corrie Ten Boom, I write as I reflect on her life, when she had experienced several years in this concentration camp, and you can read the book The Hiding Place to read all about that. But she watched her sister die, and she watched all these atrocities take place at the hands of many of the guards and Nazi guards and whatnot that worked at the concentration camp. And then, of course, through the testimony of her sister, she really came to grasp the grace and mercy of Christ, and the ability to be sustained during, all the horrific things that they had to go through, living in horrible conditions and lice and just filth and barely surviving with drops of soup every day, and all of that, and being beaten when they didn't do what they were told, and all of that. She survived all of that and saw God's mercy in her own life through her sister's testimony. And so she was speaking in a church sometime after the war was over, and during her talk, there was a man that came to her afterwards, and she recognized him as one of the guards that had committed atrocities at the concentration camp where she and her sister had suffered.
right, yeah,
And he had come to know Christ in that intervening period and heard about her and came and listened to her. And he recognized her, apparently, came up to her and spoke to her afterwards and said, I have come to know Christ. I'm kind of paraphrasing, and said, would you forgive me for all of the things that I did? And of course, Corey at that point was flabbergasted, and she froze, and she's like, how could I forgive this man who had done all these terrible things? And she didn't know how she could do so, but she just began to pray and say, God, I can't forgive him, but I know that the love of Jesus can. And so you forgive him through me. And so she just forced her hand out to his hand. He grabbed it and they started shaking hands. And as they were shaking hands, she said, I just felt this sense of warmth surge through my body and this sense of love. And I don't know where it came from other than it had to have come from God. And I had this love for this man that moments before I had nothing but hatred for. And so and part of her experience is that I have been shown mercy by God and have experienced the glory and the joy and the peace and the satisfaction that comes from knowing that even though I am a guilty sinner and though I have suffered at the hands of others, God had mercy on me. And why should I not have mercy on this person who committed these things? And to me, it's one of the most powerful testimonies to Christianity. That we as Christians have the capacity to forgive deep atrocities. Everyone feels a sense of justice. You don't even have to be a Christian to want justice to take place in this world.
You want to be fair.
For evil to be justly punished. But it takes something very special and something very powerful to extend mercy to your enemies and to be gracious towards those who wish to kill you.
Amazing.
And to me, that is one of the most powerful testimonies of the power of the gospel and of the glory of God in the face of evil.
The transformative power of
level.
Grace. The transformative power of grace and which glorifies God all the more. It's amazing. So that's the whole argument, I guess, and that brings us to a close. Thank you, Pastor Christensen, for having come on the show. I've really enjoyed talking with you about this book. It's been fascinating, and I'd loved the way you explained the greater good theodicy, the greater how God is extremely glorified through all of this, the J-shaped storyline of the redemptive arc, and the grace and glory effect, all of that. Thank you, Pastor, for coming on the show, and it's been a huge pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
If you like this video, hit the like button and don't forget to share and subscribe. If you want to watch some of Pastor Scott Christensen's interviews, put in links to those down there and you can check those out. Oh, and I've put in links to both of his books on Amazon. The one where he wrote about free will, What About Free Will? An excellent book in compatibilism. And the other one, What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. Both of them I've put in links there as well. Check them out and I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.